Also very, very grateful to the Lahore Literary Festival, the organizers, for asking me to give the keynote, and to all of you for coming here. A special thanks to the Asia Society for this venue. The lights are straight into my eyes, so I really hope that I can concentrate here. It's really, if anything can be done about that light, I'd be grateful. Okay. So before I start my talk, I just want to say that this is part of a much larger project, and what you're getting today is, in a way, a bird's eye view. It's certainly not the project as a whole, but it is a standalone lecture as far as I'm concerned. So let me begin. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The parable of his light is, as it were, that of a niche containing a lamp. The lamp is enclosed in glass, the glass shining like a radiant star. A lamp lit from a blessed tree, an olive tree that is neither of the east nor of the west. The oil whereof is so bright that it would well nigh give light of itself, even though fire had not touched it. Light upon light, God guides unto his light him that wills to be guided, and to this end God propounds parables unto men, since God alone has full knowledge of all things. This sublimely introspective Quranic verse from Surah Al-Nur 24:35 is a compelling point of departure for my inquiry into the light in Islam, or as is popularly referred to as Nuruddin, the light in religion. Invoking the expansive dimensions of Islam with reference to the Quran's light verse goes against the grain of much conventional understandings of a religion equated with illiberalism and intellectual benightedness, to say nothing of its most potent contemporary iteration as the font of global terrorism. Lit with oil from an olive tree that is neither of the east nor of the west, the lamp symbolizes God's universal revelation from time immemorial through a chain of prophets. The prophetic revelation dissipates the darkness enveloping a believer's heart, which is depicted here as a niche that, upon receiving and absorbing the light through the power of reason, is transformed into a glass shining like a radiant star that is so bright that Nurul ala nur, light upon light, it would burn even if no fire had touched it. This verse has animated Muslim thought and practice over the centuries and continues to do so to this day, especially the last quoted phrase of light untouched by fire. Most exegetes, mystics, and philosophers through the ages have read the last phrase as God guides unto his light whomever he wills. Muhammad Asad, whose translation of the Quran I have used for the Surah Nur that I've quoted, interprets it as God guides unto his light him that wills. There's a big difference there, noting that both variants are syntactically permissible. This is echoed significantly enough by the renowned Egyptian theorist of political Islam, Sayyid, though not interestingly enough by his South Asian counterpart, Abul Ala Maududi, the founder of Pakistan's Jamaat-e-Islami, who weighs in on the side of other luminaries like Yusuf Ali and also Mamadou Pickthall, among several others. Readings of the Quran, literal and figurative, do not cancel each other out. The quest for the truth of what is considered the word of God is an ongoing and unfolding process in which differences in interpretation are reflective not just of a believer's aptitude, but also the shifting needs of the time. Muslims who read the light verse as proof of God's absolute control on human thought and actions might still concede some role for human free will, if only to allow space for human responsibility. Although the overwhelmingly theocentric thrust of Muslim interpretations of the Quran is undeniable, individual free will, more often than not, counterbalances the emphasis on God's omnipresence. The individual is not only guided and granted khud ikhtiyari, individual autonomy, but has an intimate and personal relationship with the Creator, reserving the formalities of devotion for the Prophet Muhammad. The value of the Quran's light verse lies in its evocation of the expansive possibilities open to human beings to grasp and behold the world in the light of their own reason. If an idea, or even an entire worldview, Asad notes, is approached without prejudice and discerning reason, its inner consistency, truth, and wisdom become crystal clear, removing the veil of doubt and making it irrelevant whether or not it is actually touched by the fire of divine revelation. The great Persian poet Omar Khayyam has left a gem of a quatrain demonstrating how free-thinking Muslims have used their reason over the years, over the millennia, under the ruse of poetic license to defy orthodoxy without actually undermining faith in God. And this I know, whether the one true light kindle to love or wrath consume me quite, one glimpse of it within the tavern better than in the temple lost outright. The light that has fired Muslim imaginaries of their faith is not altogether unacknowledged. A case in point is the popularity of Sufism, erroneously presumed to be an antidote to Islam. This is not the place to venture into a discussion of the intrinsic relationship of Islam and Sufism and the futility of trying to pit them against each other as a corrective to the excesses of the few in the name of the many. But in the context of frontal attacks on Islam's inherent illiberality and incompatibility with ideals of Western liberalism, it is imperative to explain how far religious imperatives prevent Muslims from embracing liberal values, and conversely, whether Western liberalism is in fact designed to exclude Muslims, as Joseph Mossad in his provocative book has suggested, at least a negative referent for the actual formulation of what Western liberalism is. I will address these questions by examining Indian Muslims. How do we do this? Okay. Okay. By examining Indian Muslim responses to the liberal ideals propagated by the British in India during the late 19th and early 20th centuries as part of an elaborate imperial project to establish political control in the subcontinent in the wake of the 1857 rebellion. The contradiction between an official colonial stance of neutrality towards all religious communities in India and the definition of majority and minority on the basis of religion has had large implications for the discourse and politics of India's religious communities. Indian Muslim thinkers responded vigorously to European critiques of Islam, many of which centered directly on the life of the Prophet. While the passion of Muslim protests at the slightest hint of disparagement of their holy Prophet is notorious, not least in our own times, the thoughtful scholarship challenging negative European portrayals of the Prophet Muhammad or any other misconception about Islam has been dismissed in recent scholarship as a quote-unquote apologetic modernity. The error in this depiction stems from a confusion of categories. Muslim engagement in apologetics, a reasoned written defense of an opinion, as in the original Greek etymology of the concept, has been reduced to the more recent commonsensical English derivative of the term, meaning apology. I'm sorry. Deprived of any real access to political power in the 19th century, Muslim thinkers are viewed as apologists engaging in a non-dialogic discourse on modernity. Embracing this very facile categorization very uncritically, the late C.A. Bailey, Christopher Bailey, noted that the historiographical problem was that Muslim political thought in India, despite being more developed than any other aspect of the subcontinent's intellectual history, was rather inward-looking, focusing either on the distant sovereignty of the Khilafat or teleologically inclined towards the partition of 1947. This was why the doyen of South Asian and British imperial history concluded the question, could Muslims ever be liberals, can still be legitimately asked. Bailey concedes that the category liberal can be applied to many Muslim intellectuals, albeit with quote-unquote some reservations. Muslims have quote-unquote irreducible beliefs and principles rooted in the prophetic tradition and faith in the absolute verity of the Quran that constrain their wholehearted commitment to either liberalism or nationalism, unquote. What is more, the Muslim worldview is largely incommensurable and circumvents the West's own modernity, unquote. Now, there's a world of difference between a claim to distinctiveness and the assertion of an identity that is incommensurable with Western modernity. Based on an extremely limited reading of the extant evidence, the assessment is dismissive of Muslim efforts, not just in South Asia, but also globally, to critically engage with and contribute to liberal ideas and values circulating in the age of empire. There is a need to go beyond the distorting label of apologetic modernity to grasp the different strands of Muslim thinking on freedom, identity, and above all, religion, before arriving at a firm conclusion about their proclivity for illiberal ideas and practices. Reiterating the organic relationship between the religious and secular aspects of a Muslim's life did not mean that Islam was immune from historical processes of secularization. The great 19th century North Indian Muslim reformer, Sayyid Ahmad, once commented that deen and dunya had a strange relationship. Leaving religion does not result in leaving the world, but leaving the world does result in leaving religion. Sayyid Ahmad Khan may be, as Bailey puts it, the most overexposed of Muslim thinkers. But I think he merits a reevaluation, if only to underline his role as the leading expositor of Roshan Khayali, or enlightened thinking, which has several variants in the Urdu language, such as, I'm just having Azad Khayali, free thinking. You have Roshan Zamir, enlightened consciousness. You have the Maghi Wusat, broad-mindedness. And you have Wasiul Mashrab, open-mindedness. His designation as a British loyalist, or teleologically as the Indian Muslim who laid the basis for India's partition and the creation of Pakistan, has prevented the multifaceted and wide-ranging nature of his thinking and teachings on social and religious reform from being fully appreciated. And then the label of apologetic modernity ensures that no Pakistani actually bothers reading what he's actually written. Which is true for most things, but I think that's particularly irritating with Sir Sayyid. Following the 18th century, Muslim scholar Shah Waliullah, Sir Sayyid held that there was only one unchanging deen, religion, which was rational and just because it was consistent with human nature. Since all religions draw upon a common core of ethical values, religiously based differences were not, in his view, insurmountable obstacles to peaceful coexistence. Sayyid Ahmad Khan's open-mindedness towards other religious communities and campaign against religious bigotry amongst his own community is well known, even though that has not prevented people from categorizing him as the father of the quote-unquote two-nation theory. His published works, and especially theological writings and debates with Christian critics of Islam, have received far more scholarly attention than his innumerable essays on religion, ethics, education, and social reforms, written in extremely accessible Urdu for a more general readership. Concerned with reforming Muslim social ethics with the help of modern education, Sayyid Ahmad and his associates in the Aligarh movement spearheaded a sustained and lacerating critique of Muslim society. If this is one reason why he cannot simply be dismissed as an apologist, his portrayal as an abject loyalist whose sense of Muslimness clouded his vision of Indian unity is equally suspect. Both categorizations fray at the seams when the loyalist turned apologist in Sayyid Ahmad Khan is just simply located within the historical context of 19th century colonial India. After 1857, Sayyid Ahmad had despaired at the predicament of his countrymen and contemplated migrating to Egypt. He found solace in national service based on promoting education. He told the Mohammedan Literary Society of Calcutta in 1863 that nothing but patriotism possessed him. Religious differences veiled the real unity among all created beings. One way to end this seeming disunion was to exert ourselves for the good of our fellow creatures, just as we would do for our own. Many of our fellow countrymen, though not co-religionists, he noted, were excelling only because of their knowledge of English. He said this without any envious feelings and only to encourage and incite his fellow countrymen to strive to equal them. Calling for an educational jihad, he urged Indians to diligently strive to master English so that, as in the past, they may surpass the rest of the races of the East. In Ghazipur, he helped set up a school with subscriptions from wealthy Indians which taught Urdu, English, Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit. His friend Raj Hardev Narayan Singh was one of the first patrons. Sayyid Ahmad's high hopes of national unity were dashed once a group of Hindus in Benares began agitating to replace Urdu in the Persian script with Hindi written in Devanagari in government institutions. Convinced that cooperation between the two communities would become increasingly difficult, he decided to focus on the education of his own co-religionists. Sayyid Ahmad's trip to England in 1869 was an invigorating and transformative experience. Without absolving the English for looking upon Indians as animals and lowly beings beneath contempt, he attributed their prejudice to policies based on a lack of understanding. Assuming the conceit of colonial civilizational discourse, Sayyid Ahmad noted that if Indians became civilized through education, they would equal, if not surpass, the English. After returning from London in 1870, he launched a journal called Tehzeeb al-Akhlaq, based on Ibn Miskawah's famous work on ethics. It was patterned on the Tatler and the Spectator started by Richard Steele and Joseph Addison in the early 18th century to improve English ethical life. Sayyid Ahmad hoped to emulate their feat by encouraging rational and critical discussion so that Muslims would follow in the footsteps of their illustrious ancestors, whose Roshan Damaghi, or enlightened minds, had once spread knowledge to the limits of Europe, western limits of Europe. The publication's English subtitle, The Mohammedan Social Reformer, indicates his intention to use ethical debates as instruments of social change. An ethical revolution could make Indians and Muslims in particular desirous of the best kind of civilization. The message of, quote, the innocent, straightforward, and kind-hearted prophet who had explained God's laws in a clear and simple way to the ignorant and illiterate Arab nation was distorted with petty criticisms and philosophical proofs and argumentation to such an extent that there was nothing clear or simple left in it. Steele and Addison had improved English culture without dwelling on religion. We too would like to avoid religious issues, Sayyid Ahmad asserted. But in India, if one advocated giving up something, it was proclaimed a religious virtue. When one said learn something, it was declared forbidden by religion. Consequently, there was no choice but to enter into religious debate while discussing the refinement of culture and the betterment of society. Sayyid Ahmad famously has blamed ta'assub, or religious bigotry, for the ruination of the individual and the community. Given the depths of bigotry among the Indian ulama, the community was riven with extreme forms of cultural prejudice, which were wrongly ascribed to religion. The Quran condemns false pride and inconsideration towards others, which is the wont of the bigot. Moreover, it warns against a stubborn refusal to acknowledge the signs of the time as signs of God, which are everywhere, to the east and to the west. Bigotry was a bar to reading them and contrary to everything in Islam. In 1876, the Sayyid suspended publication of the Tehzeeb-ul-Akhlaq to focus on establishing Aligarh College. While retaining a keen interest in ethical issues, the focus towards the end of his life was on building an educational institution where young Muslim men, and some Hindus too, could be reared in the spirit of fellow feeling and liberality, which he believed were the building blocks for national unity. Needing continued financial patronage from the colonial state for Aligarh College, Sayyid Ahmad made loyalty his politics. But I think it's really important to emphasize in this regard, he was no different from any other late 19th century Indian publicist, whether Hindu, Muslim, or Sikh. And finally, for a man who placed reason above emotion and disliked slavish imitation, Sayyid Ahmad Khan remained committed to religiously informed cultural values, which were the source of the mental and spiritual subjugation of Muslim women. He supported women's education and giving them the property rights conferred to them in Islam, but the education he advocated for women was restricted to a study of the Quran and the prophetic traditions and had to take place exclusively within the confines of the domesticated space of the Muslim home. He changed much later, but this was his initial position. If his stance on women stymies Sayyid Ahmad's liberal modernist agenda for the ethical reform of the Muslim community, so does that of several Hindus, such as Madan Mohan Malviya, lauded as the torch-bearer of communitarian liberalism by my friend and late friend and mentor, Christopher Bailey. Despite his limitations, Sayyid Ahmad raised a range of key issues in his writings that remains salient well over a century after his death. Okay. Among the more memorable of these is Sayyid Ahmad's efforts through the Tehzeeb-ul-Akhlaq to initiate a sea change in Muslim thinking about religion, ethics, and selfhood. In an article published in April of 1894 entitled "The Effects of the World on Religion," he observed that just as religion affected worldly thought, habits, customs, and culture, and the economy, worldly affairs also influenced religion and religious beliefs. Sayyid Ahmad embarked on a detailed study of the role of religion in human history, a process in which, far from being inward-looking or illiberal in disposition, he displayed a keen open-mindedness based on rational inquiry, akin to earlier Muslim freethinkers and equal to many Western rationalists of his own time. While aimed at a Muslim audience, his essays on religion and human history were influenced by the works of giants like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and engaged with Western authors, dispelling the charge of insularity leveled against him by the exponents of an apologetic modernity. Arguing that religion was a natural human disposition that existed since time immemorial, Sayyid Ahmad noted that all religious traditions were based on the principles of Wahdatul Wujud, the unity of creation, including Hinduism. And here he was clearly referring to Ram Mohan Roy's Tuhfatul Mu'addin. So Sayyid Ahmad's liberal humanism, in Bailey's estimation, is more expansive than even John Stuart Mill's one of the canonical figures of British liberalism, whose influence is discernible in Sayyid Ahmad's essays in Tehzeeb-ul-Akhlaq. Yet significantly, Bailey still places Sayyid Ahmad out of the club of Indian liberals like Badruddin Tayyibji, a member of the Bohra community and a lawyer who served as the third president of the Indian National Congress. Tayyibji, in Bailey's view, merits the adjective more than most Indian liberals, certainly more than Amir Ali and Sayyid Ahmad Khan, because instead of being an apologist modernist, Tayyibji's vision was historically and culturally relativistic, as he accepted, Bailey says, that whatever glories of early Islam, the intellectual and scientific achievements of the West in the previous 200 years were unparalleled. Like European liberals, Tayyibji wanted to separate off religion from the secular authority and to define the community mullahs to confine the community mullahs to a teaching role exclusively. The attempt to detach religion from politics constituted an important distinction, Bailey argues, between Tayyibji's political thought and that of many other Muslim intellectuals. This assessment is contradicted by several of Sayyid Ahmad's own writings, including one for Tehzeeb-ul-Ikhlaq called Religion and Society in 1879, and also the works of several of his associates. Making a clear distinction between religious and worldly affairs, Sayyid Ahmad noted that human history in general and Muslim history in particular showed that the causes of human degradation lay in turning worldly matters, which are constantly changing, into religious strictures that are completely unchangeable. Ridiculing the bearded, above-ankle pajama-wearing Maulvis who questioned his faith, Sayyid Ahmad recounted how the Prophet's ban on wearing garments below the ankles had come to be considered by some Muslims as a matter of religious duty. Rich Arabs used to wear flowing garments that dragged behind on the ground, gathering dust as a sign of their higher social status. What the Prophet was censoring was the arrogance attached to wearing excessive clothing in a context where the poor had barely enough clothing to cover their bodies. But this was taken literally by the ulema. Even if someone wore a garment by mistake that happened to be dragging below an ankle with no idea that it symbolized arrogance, he is banished to hellfire for all time to come, leaving people astonished at what kind of religion this was, in which wearing the garments above the ankle wins you paradise, and wearing it below the ankle consigns you to hell. This was then erroneously considered to be the original religion of Islam. Calling for nothing less than a complete Islamic reformation based on critical reasoning and an engagement with advances in modern knowledge, Sayyid Ahmad Khan sounds neither inward nor apologetic. If he was correcting his co-religionists' misunderstanding of religion in one piece, he was critiquing British misconceptions of Islam in another. In an essay in the Tehzeeb-ul-Ikhlaq entitled Ethics, he contested Addison's opinion that there were two parts to religion. Parts of religion, beliefs that were founded solely on revelation and practices that were based on human ethics. In Sayyid Ahmad's view, beliefs related to matters whose conception is not impossible on the basis of reason and natural laws. Ethics, however, did not need the support of religion. Rather, ethics were needed to grasp the truth of beliefs and religion. But he liked the general drift of Addison's thought on the importance of ethics, especially its heart-warming conclusion, quoting Jonathan Swift. "We have just enough religion to make us hate, but not enough to make us love one another." Sayyid Ahmad Khan's thinking on religion, freedom of opinion, and accommodation of religious differences ought to qualify him for the League of Liberals without reservations, but that's not the point. Who wants to be in that league? However, the apologetic modernity label and the notion of Islam's incommensurability with Christianity has foreclosed unqualified inclusion into this exclusive liberal fraternity, making it reasonable to ask whether Western liberalism, if it is not designed to exclude Muslims, considers Islam as really a negative reference point for its own self-construction. The commonplace view of Islam as the other of Christianity is a very recent construct, fairly recent. In a Europe riddled with religious strife and conflict in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the teachings of Islam, interestingly enough, provided a counterweight that radical Protestants, for instance, deployed in opposing Catholic tyranny. It was only in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars that Islam seems to have been systematically cast as the other of a Christian Europe, a process that gained momentum after the 1857 rebellion in India. Okay, against which philosophy of liberalism is Islam being judged? Duncan Bell, in a very insightful essay entitled "What is Liberalism?" outlines the problem rather well. Liberalism, at the turn of the 20th century, was identified, he argues, in the English-speaking world with the French and American revolutions and the spread of global capitalism. A constellation of ideas that embraced socialism and focused on utility, democracy, and political economy. The shift in the transfer of scholarly authority from Britain to the United States of America in the post-World War II era came to be fully reflected in the dominant narratives of liberalism by the turn of the 21st century. Now the threads of liberal philosophy were not traced to the to the French Revolution, but to the glorious revolution of 1688 and the religious wars in Europe, with a foregrounding of natural rights, the social contract, and constitutionalism. If Jeremy Bentham occupied the limelight in the British-dominated narrative of liberalism, there has been a showcasing of John Locke in the contemporary American-influenced narrative of liberalism since 1950s. Western liberalism's own contradictions, an emphasis on liberty, equality, and democracy, and the simultaneous enslavement and exploitation of people, the promotion and preservation of inequalities and anti-democratic tendencies made it an unlikely first choice of philosophy for most Muslims and many Hindus too, even in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This had less to do with the illiberalism of these Muslims than with their aversion to European colonialism after a long history of political ascendancy. According to Bailey, it was not any defined sense of racial distinctiveness, but an antipathy to their manners that marked Europeans as the other for Indians. Muslims deplored the lack of adab, or proper behavior, among alien rulers. European manners, however, by no means universally rejected by all Indians, including many Muslims. It was the institutionalized practices of racial distinctiveness and exclusion, as well as the denial of liberalism's core principles like liberty, freedom of opinion, and equality that elicited the strongest responses from colonial subjects. Far from protesting their marginalization, if not exclusion, from the colonial project of liberalism, people like Sayyid Ahmad used reference from within the Islamic tradition in criticisms of European imperialism and its self-justifying ideologies. A measured ambivalence towards liberalism was not a stance of Muslim insularity and fixation on the prophetic tradition, but based on reasoned assessments of Islamic teachings and an understanding of history. Muslim as well as global history. Like other Indian Muslims, Sayyid Ahmad also connected with other co-religionists in different parts of the world in efforts to challenge Western writers and policy makers who portrayed the faithful as antagonistic to all kinds of reform and progress. The issue foremost, of course, in the minds of Muslims in this period was none other than that of liberty. In extensively researched essays written for the Tehzeeb ul-Akhlaq on slavery, Sayyid Ahmad discussed the immorality of the Atlantic slave trade, praising abolitionists like William Wilberforce, Henry Browman for their humane efforts in helping bring an end to the curse. He went on he went so far as to refer to the Somerset versus Stewart case 4 years before the American Declaration of Independence, which paved the way for the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and the proclamation banning slavery in British colonies in 1834. The light in Islam was there for those who willed it. In an essay called Freedom of Slaves, published on April 15th, 1877, Sayyid Ahmad Khan reproduced the Urdu translation of a response written in October of 1863 by the learned and militarily distinguished State Minister Hussein Pasha to the American Council, Amos Perry's questions regarding the government of Tunisia's proclamation ending slavery. Hussein Pasha extolled freedom, deeming it a key feature of refinement. He recounted an incident that occurred in 1856 at the Paris Opera, where upon seeing Hussein Pasha accompanied by a black slave, an American went berserk and jumped upon the slave like a cat on a mouse, seizing his clothes and protesting at his presence. An attendant intervened and explained to the American that with the Tunisians, status was not based on the color of the skin, but on one's abilities, on one's capacities and excellences. Sayyid Ahmad Khan praised Hussein Pasha's response, but he had an additional question. The point that Hussein Pasha is making is that the slave's fine clothes don't save him, but the attendant's simple statement of truth does get the point, and the American lays off his hands. Sayyid Ahmad Khan praises Pasha's response, but he had an additional question for which there was no answer in the text. He had never found any reference in the Quran on the legitimacy of slavery, and he asked if the ulama of Constantinople, Tunis, and Egypt could refer to any Quranic verse that recommends slavery. The transnational Muslim discourse on the universality of human liberty underlines the search for answers from within Muslim history and the Islamic tradition, while at the same time engaging with a range of ideas that fashioned what later came to be understood as Western liberalism. Sayyid Ahmad was a pioneer in this search. His intellectual legatees would be far more skeptical of the liberalism of empire as they moved away from the loyalism that characterized much of late 19th century political thought, Hindu and Muslim alike. While taking a more radical political posture against British imperialism, many Muslim thinkers continue to travel along an intellectual avenue illuminated by Sayyid Ahmad Khan, despite all his the distractions and the abuse that has been lavished at him. The founder of Aligarh, far from being constrained by an irreducible core of Muslim faith, had shown the way forward by drawing on the history of Muslim enlightenment that accepted reason as the beacon of light. His nuanced stance on the scourge of slavery had been inspired by Nur ala Nur, light upon light. He was confident that God could not encumber believers with the humiliation of unthinking imitation and the fallacies of treating social customs as religion, but rather would lighten their hearts with Nur-e Hakiki, the truth, the light of truth, if they so wished, sparking human creativity and innovation in keeping with the changing demands of the time. Thank you very much.